Good morning. It's been kind of a roller coaster week this past week. Last Sunday was the very first time I venture to say any of us ever had a video worship service on Easter Sunday. And then Sunday night, the storms rolled through and brought some destruction and even some death to our area. And I'm thankful that we all weathered it safely, but I'm also mindful of those who didn't. And then there's been lots and lots of different news reports this week, one saying one thing and another saying something else about when things may reopen and when this quarantine and shelter in place may be over with. And it's left us kind of confused and we don't really know what's going on, but it's still in God's hands, and I'm thankful for that. Let me ask you, are you a spontaneous person and you never know what's coming next in your life? Or are you one who likes routine and structure in your life? My guess is that most of us like a little bit of structure at least, maybe some more than others. And we like routine, and we only enjoy something spontaneous occasionally, like maybe when we're on a vacation. I know I tend to be like that, and sometimes I'm accused of being in a rut, which is probably true. But every once in a while, I think I can be a little bit spontaneous. Several years ago, Vicki and I and Andrew and Jonathan enjoyed a weekend over at Larry and Lee's cabin in Ellijay. And after I got up on Saturday morning and fixed breakfast for everybody, I suggested as an activity, because we were looking for something to do, so let's just go out and look at some cars. I knew the boys enjoyed that. It was a pretty day, and I figured we'd have fun doing that. But before we left, I said, remember, we're just looking, we're not buying. Little did I know that we would end up trading Vicky's Toyota Camry in that day for the Ford 500 that she drives today. That was totally out of character for me, but it was exciting, and we still talk about that day today. For most of us, unless we're watching a suspenseful movie or something with a little bit of fright involved in it, we're more comfortable knowing what's going to happen next. We like the comfort of normalcy. But what happens when that normalcy is turned upside down? What happens when you're suddenly thrust into a new normal? I've been hearing that term this week, and you probably have too, that we have a new normal. There's lots of things that could happen in our lives to cause that, but right now, we're all dealing with something that has upended all of our lives. And it's not just here in Dalton, it's around the country and even around the world. And it's easy to look around and see worry and fear and sometimes even panic in people's lives. But it's very important that we don't get caught up in it. So, what can we do to remain stable in this time of instability? Well, the first thing is we need to understand that uncertainty fuels instability. And the irony is, we know life is unpredictable. I know it, you know it, but for the most part, we live in the predictable. Yeah, there's some minor unpredictable things that happen sometimes, and they can somewhat happen regularly occasionally, but they're usually not too intrusive. And sometimes they can be some enjoyable things, like a surprise visit from a friend or some family or an unexpected blessing that comes into our life. But that's not normal. And since what we would consider to be something major happens so infrequently, we don't usually give it much thought until it happens. But when it does, it can fill us with some major concerns. And we start playing the what if game in our head. What if I lose my job? What if I get the virus? What if this quarantine doesn't end soon? And the scary part about all that is each of those what ifs could actually happen. But the problem is, if we're not careful, those what ifs can rule our thinking. And many of the what ifs that we conjure up are far fetched and pretty unlikely. But in our minds, we turn them into the probable outcome. And when you have uncertainties and you mix them with a fear of the unknown, you have the perfect formula for instability. The word instability or unstable means unsteady and insecure. And one reason why people are panicking right now is because their security system has been shaken. I'm seeing people coming into the store now buying guns that they would never have considered buying guns before. But the reason is because in their minds, Their security is in doubt, and they want to be able to protect themselves and protect their family in this uncertain time. But if we base our security on a job or a bank account or being able to purchase the things at the store that we always used to purchase whenever we wanted them, and now they're not there, then we're going to panic when all that changes. When the predictable becomes unpredictable, we can get overwhelmed pretty quickly. Our rock has crumpled. Our security blanket has been ripped away. So what are we going to do? Where are we going to turn for help? Well, the answer is the Lord. He will help us to deal with this unstable situation. The book of Psalm, chapter 20, verses 7 and 8 says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They are brought to their knees and fall, but we rise and stand firm." Whatever we trust in outside of the Lord is always going to be insecure. But if we trust in Him, we can be sure that we're going to find firmness and security in our lives. But even though we trust in the Lord and we're not given to panic, it can still cause us to feel a little bit uneasy when we start thinking about all this COVID-19 thing. So what can we do? Well, one thing that will help us to be stable is to know that this too shall pass. This new normal that we're experiencing is only temporary, and we can all look forward to the time when this new normal becomes our old past. But that day isn't here yet. All we have is what's in front of us. And sometimes when we see what's in front of us, it isn't a very pretty sight. But still, having something to look forward to can help us to remain stable now. Another thing we can do is to focus on the positives. What's going well? What's still intact? What's still working? Well, take the church, for example. We could focus on the fact that we can't meet together right now, or we could rejoice that through modern technology, we can still have the opportunity to meet, virtually, if nothing else. And we can focus on the fact that instead of being cooped up in the house, we have each other to share with and bond with. If we consume ourselves with what's wrong, then we'll never see what's right. And we should always remember that it could always be worse. Even though this virus is scary, it doesn't have a very high mortality rate. And we still have our homes and our food to eat and friends and family to call on. And no matter what, God remains a constant in our life. His peace, His joy, His stability can be a constant presence in our life. And we need to hold on to that. Uncertainty fuels instability, but knowing God is there keeps us stable. We also need to remember that God is there when we slip. David said in Psalm 94, verses 18 and 19, "When I said my foot is slipping, your love, O Lord, supported me. When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought joy to my soul." I used to do a lot of hiking and backpacking when I was a scoutmaster, and one time I was taking the boys to a campsite in the Cohutta Wilderness, and right before we got to the campsite, we had to cross a small creek. Now, thankfully, it wasn't deep, but I still didn't want to get wet if I didn't have to. So I was being very careful and stepping on the stones to step across this little creek about 10 feet wide. But about halfway across, one of the stones I stepped on was slippery, and my feet came out from under me, and I ended up sitting in about 6 inches of cold water. I wasn't hurt, just embarrassed. But I learned a very important lesson there and began carrying a walking stick with me wherever I went hiking after that. And that extra support was oftentimes like a helping hand, keeping me from slipping. When David said, "My foot is slipping," he was referring to feeling weak in the face of the enemy's strength. He was taken off guard, and he started losing his footing. And we can be that way sometimes. Our enemy's power strikes us out of nowhere, and we lose our balance. We lose our stability. And sometimes we even lose our spiritual footing. We start to have unhealthy, instinctive reactions to those enemy forces, and we start to panic. But David said when his foot started to slip, God's love supported him. Some translations say, God held me up. You ever felt like you were slipping, but you felt the love of God wash over you? What does that do for us? It lifts us up and sets us back on the right path. When we need support, he's there to provide it. When Peter was walking on the water that evening and he started to sink, Jesus was there to pull him up. And there's something interesting that happened in that story that I want you to see. You remember the story. It's found in Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 28. And Peter had one of his brilliant ideas. He figured, well, if that really was Jesus, all he had to do was call to him, and then he could walk on the water too and walk out to Jesus. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus basically said, well, come on. Peter said, if it's you, Lord, call me and I'll come. And Jesus said, come on. And Peter got out of the boat and started walking to Jesus. But when he saw the wind and the waves, he began to panic just a little bit, and he started to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus did. And then in verse 32 it says, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Now, whenever I've read that verse before, I guess I kind of just glossed over it. But as I was thinking about it today, I noticed something. How did Peter and Jesus get back to the boat? Did Jesus give Peter a piggyback ride? Maybe, but I doubt it. I bet he made him walk. And my guess is that as they walked back, Peter was still a little bit afraid because the wind and the waves were still there. But Jesus was with him. And notice that the wind didn't stop until they got back in the boat. Our current situation may feel like the wind is blowing and the waves are crashing and our faith is being put to the test. We know that Jesus is here, but still, the situation is still very scary. And like Peter, we sometimes take our eyes off to Jesus and start to look at the shaky economy, and we start to look at our uncertain job situation or the empty store shelves. And we get upset over not being able to go places and do things like we did before, and we lose our footing and we begin to sink. So we cry out to Jesus to rescue us, and he does. And we think, that was a close one. I'm glad that's over. But then he always reminds us we need to get back in the boat. And the wind's still blowing, and the waves are still crashing. And we wonder, when are we going to make it back to the boat so the wind will die down? I don't know. People have asked me how long I think this is going to last, and I have to say, I don't know. But the when isn't ours to know. So we shouldn't get caught up in predictions. We just need to remember that God is with us, and he's got us in his hands. Back in Psalm 94, David had some anxiety. Now keep in mind, this is the guy who chased after bears and lions when they took one of his sheep, or this is the guy who stood before a 9-foot-tall giant, armed just with a slingshot, and took him down. This is King David, the warrior king. And it just goes to show that the best of us can fall prey to anxiety. We're not exempt, not any of us. And when it happens, we need to deal with it. You ever wonder why they keep a horse in a stable? It's because it gives the horse a sense of security, and it keeps it from running loose. And we need to be kept from getting loose and letting our thoughts run wild. David said God's consolation brought joy to his soul. Sometimes that's translated as tranquilizing my spirit. I like that. Sometimes a vet will have to tranquilize an animal so he can work on him and help him. And sometimes God needs to tranquilize us so they can work on us and help us. When we're anxious, we need to allow the Holy Spirit to calm us down so that his joy and his comfort and his peace and his strength can take over. God's love and consolation is there to relieve us when we're anxious and rescue us when we slip. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 calls God the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. But sometimes people don't feel his comfort because they're angry with him, and they spend their time ranting at him and venting at him about all the troubles they've got. It's like they're saying, I won't be consoled by God because he didn't do what I wanted him to do in my time frame. So instead of listening for God, they just tell him all about their troubles. Do you remember when God was dealing with the prophet Elijah after his contest on the mountain there with the prophets of Baal? Elijah wanted to tell him how bad he had it. And he kept saying, woe is me, basically. I'm the only one left. But God was wanting to tell Elijah something. And he didn't do it through the fire or the whirlwind or the earthquake. He presented himself in a gentle whisper. And Elijah was smart enough to pick up on it, but a lot of folks aren't. They only think God presents himself in strong, powerful ways, and they're not looking for God to whisper, and therefore they miss the comforting, gentle whisper of God. Someone pointed out recently that we've had all of our distractions taken away because of this COVID-19 situation we're in. And for the last couple of weeks, we can't go to the movies. We can't go attend a ball game. We can't even go shopping like we used to. God's been trying to get our attention, like my dad used to do when I was a child, and yours probably did with you. They would take you by your face on either side and hold it and look you in the eye, and they would fix it so you couldn't look at anything else. You had to look at them. I had to focus on him and what he was saying. God's got our attention now, doesn't he? Are we listening? One final thing. Isaiah chapter 32, verses 17 through 20 says, the fruit of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quietness and confidence forever. My people will live in peaceful dwelling places, in secure homes, in undisturbed places of rest. Though hail flatten the forest and the city is leveled completely, how blessed you will be. Earlier in this chapter, Isaiah was chastising some of the Israelites who were being complacent toward God, but they still felt secure. They felt like they were all right because they were Israelites. And Isaiah said, things are about to change. Things are about to change. He said their crops and their vineyards would stop producing and their land would become a desolate wasteland. And then he talks about those whose faith remained strong to God as contrast to these unfaithful Israelites. And even though they still have to deal with the hail that flattened the forest and their city that had been completely leveled, Isaiah says they're living in peace and quietness and confidence. That's security. That's stability. The world may be falling apart all around us, but we're at peace. It's not that we're oblivious or in denial. I'm fully aware of what's happening in the world right now. But because my confidence is placed in God, I can live in peace and in love and in harmony. And the effect of that peace is being calm and confident in times of turmoil, fully realizing how blessed I am. Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 9 says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious for anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, he says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. You know, there's a lot there that pertains to our current situation. We need to rejoice, even in quarantine, or even if we get the virus. Paul said it twice in case we weren't sure he really meant it. He said, rejoice, and I'll say it again, rejoice. Then he says we need to let our gentleness be evident to all. When people get edgy and short-tempered, imagine how much of a testimony it would be for them to see us display a calm, gentle spirit. And then he said, the Lord is near. That's an important thing. Not only is he not absent, he's right next to us. He's close by, right here with us. So there's no reason to be anxious about anything. And then Paul reminds us to keep our prayer lives going. And that's a key to being stable in times of instability. Keep that communication line open to God. We need to be praying for the health and the safety and the well-being of others as well as for ourselves. And we need to thank him for all he's done for us through all of this. And in doing so, He says the peace of God will guard us against anxiety and panic. And then instead of focusing on the negative, focusing on positive things that are still there. You may need to look for them, but they're still there. The lovely, excellent, and praiseworthy things may not be quite as obvious, since the cloud of this current situation can easily block our view of all things pure and noble, but they're there. Look for them. And finally, Paul ends by telling us to put godliness into practice. Continue in your righteous living. Regardless of what changes are happening in your lives, continue in what God's called us to do. And don't worry, because God is with us. I'm praying for you this week, and I encourage you to pray for each other and pray for our world, and ask the Lord that this situation can be removed just as quickly as He sees fit.